What's up, guys? Today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, literally my favorite topic in all of motion imaging, middle gray. So here's the deal. Middle gray is your secret key for better understanding and shaping your motion images. If you want to shape better images, create better looks, have mastery over your image pipeline, or be able to figure things out without a YouTube video, middle gray is one of the biggest tools that you can have in your toolkit for being able to do so. So in this episode of Grade School, we are diving deep on, as I said, my favorite subject in all of motion imaging, middle gray. So that's what we got on deck today. My buddy Annie's here with me. What's going on, Annie?
Hey guys, what's up? I'm excited to get into this because I think I can give middle gray a little more love than I do currently.
It sounds so boring, and yet it's so fascinating. There's so much to it. So for those of you guys who didn't join for our last round of grade school, we're trying out a slightly different format of grade school today, where we're going to be doing more of a live training and taking questions as we go along, but kind of staying on a single theme. And I'm going to try to give you all some knowledge in the first chunk of the session, and then we'll have some more open time to discuss whatever aspects of the topic at hand you want to in order to kind of flesh out your understanding. So as I said, this is my favorite topic. I'm going to try my very best to keep this to like under 3 hours because I have a lot to say about it. But jokes aside, we'll stick to our regulation grade school hour. But I do have a lot to cover, so I'm going to dive in. Get your questions ready. Type your questions in as we go along. I'll be pausing periodically, and Annie will be able to feed me whatever questions you guys have along the way to make sure that you're tracking with me as we go through our exploration of middle gray. Okay, let me get my
Quick
screen.
interjection. I think we have you pretty quiet right now, Cullen, if we can
Oh,
bump your
okay. Let me
audio.
make sure I am coming through here. Let's see. Okay, that seems good. One sec. Okay, I just gave it a rather sizable boost, so keep an eye on the chat, Annie, and let me know if I'm blowing out any eardrums, and if so, my apologies. Let's see how we do with this. Okay, everybody, let's dive in. So we've got a couple things that I want to talk about here, but I really want to start from the basics of like what middle gray is, where it comes from, why we should care about it at all as colorists, because my first interactions with it were more on a sort of color sciencey basis. And I'm like, oh, that's something more for color scientists to be concerned with than colorists. But the reality is this is something that can really, really shape and improve and optimize our workflow as colorists in a number of different ways that we're going to look at specific examples of in a couple minutes here. But to start kind of from biggest picture, let's talk about what middle gray is for a second. So middle gray is simply a way of designating in exact numerical terms the reflectance level of middle exposure in our scene. Okay, that's typically agreed to be 18%. Rather arbitrarily, there's actually nothing really magical about that number. It's just generally agreed to be 18% reflectance of whatever illuminant is lighting the scene. 18% reflectance is tends to be middle gray. That's what you will get if you bounce if you properly light like a color checker chart, for example. And I'm actually going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see what the heck I'm talking about. So we're going to actually fast forward a little bit here. We're going to talk in just a moment about the scene to screen journey, because there's a multi-leg journey in terms of how mid-gray travels from scene all the way out to screen. But just to give you a sense of what I mean when I say that 18% is sort of like the agreed upon middle exposure level, and that's what we're going to see like in our gray card here, let's turn all of our color management off for a second. And we're going to be doing this a lot today here. It's just stripping things back to normal. And what I want to do is go back to what this camera sensor actually sees. This is a Alexa 35 that we're looking at here. So what this camera actually sees in terms of tonality, and by the way, we're going to be very focused on tonality today. One of the reasons that I really love middle gray is because it allows us to decouple concerns about reproduction of color and concerns about reproduction of tone, contrast, exposure, etc. Of course, those things highly interrelate, but if we have to bite them all off at once, understand them all at once, keep them straight all at once conceptually and in terms of a pipeline, it gets really, really challenging to get that stuff sort of like underneath our feet, if that makes sense. So everything that I'm talking about today really applies to tonality more than to color. But in that spirit, if we look at, I'm going to simplify everything that I've got here. All I'm doing is converting this log state image back to linear. Linear is the state of the image when it hits our camera sensor, any camera sensor. And then from there, different camera sensors, different cameras are going to do different things. Some might encode them to log, some might encode them into a raw format, but it all starts in a linear response. And remember, a linear tone curve, linear light, that's the domain of light out in the real world. That's why we call it linear. Always sounds obvious to me to say, but out in the real world, operating in linear light, if I double the amount of light and then I measure that change using a linear measurement device, I will get double the reading that I had a moment ago. That's literally all that linear light means. But that's the domain of the real physical world, and it's only when eyes and cameras and displays get involved that we have to think about anything else. So before any of that happens, and right at the point of the camera sensor, we're still here in good old linear. And let's take a look at our waveform here for a second. And I'm going to set a level on my waveform of 18. And let's look at what happens if I window the, where's my window? Oh, do I need my overlays turned back on? There we go. So if we window this patch, and we go into our highlight mode here, you can see this can be a little bit deceiving because I've got this big thick white line up here at the 50 mark, but that represents this. That represents this black backdrop. But over here, look at where the actual piece of image that I'm in highlight mode on, look where it's landing in relation to that reference level of 18 that I just set. It's right on that 18% line. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about ground truth, 18% gray. We are starting 18% linear. Now, this looks zany, all kinds of other stuff needs to happen, and we're going to talk through that process in a minute, but I just want to give you that sort of like anchor point, that foundation, that concept that when we talk about 18% gray or middle gray, this is the starting point of that conversation. It's in the scene itself, the reflectance level of the scene light bouncing off of a middle exposed thing. By the way, that could be a mid-gray card. That could also be like a subject. There's going to be more variance there because different people have different reflectance levels in their skin, but this is kind of the holy grail. This is what mid-gray represents. And in terms of like sort of conceptualizing why this matters, like why we should care about this, here's the biggest thing. I already alluded to this a little bit. So when we think about tonality and color, and we think about the opportunity to separate those things out and think about them in separate chunks and focus just on the tonality and the contrast aspect, as I mentioned a moment ago, that's excellent. That's really helpful for us. Mid-gray allows us to focus even more narrowly on a particular part of the tonality of our image, and that is the middle exposed or the linear portion of our reproduced image. So some of you guys may know reproducing an image is not about, for a variety of reasons, it's not about giving me a one-to-one like experience or visual coming off of my display as I was looking at in the original scene. There are aspects of the original scene that we want to accurately, meaningfully reproduce, but almost none of that scene is going to be reproduced truly one-to-one in terms of what I saw over here and what the image itself looks like over there if I'm like standing on set monitoring, okay? But what's interesting, one of the interesting things about middle gray is this point in the tone curve is where that one-to-one-ness will be the most the case. We will have the most one-to-one reproduction at this point in the imaging pipeline, all right? So everywhere else, like if we look at another experiment that, or another kind of like preview of where we're gonna be going in a moment here, let's turn this off for a moment, and I'm gonna grab my exposure chart, which right now I have set to just reproduce a patch of gray. And what's fun here is if we can understand how this simple patch of gray flows forward and is altered and changed and remapped as we go along, it becomes quite easy to start adding steps. And you can see as I add steps here, and especially when I start to turn on my color management, you can see things are being shaped in a non-linear way. They're being rolled at the top and bottom. These stops are being adjusted. So it's all about anchoring around our middle gray point and then building our understanding out around there in terms of the additional compression and shaping and nonlinear stuff that's going to happen above and below around this linear most point of the journey. Okay? So as I said, midgray represents the reflectance level in our scene, or rather, midgray is the reflectance level in our scene that represents middle exposure, typically agreed to be 18% linear. And midgray actually goes all the way back to film. Back in the film days, midgray was referred to as laboratory aim density, and it was used for the same purposes that I'm talking about right now, of essentially ensuring a meaningful relationship between scene and screen. If we want to like put a big TLDR, big umbrella over everything that we're talking about today, why we should care about midgray, why it matters, what it's useful for, that is what it is useful for, is ensuring a meaningful relationship between scene and screen. It's not quite a one-to-one relationship because things above and below midgray are really going to shape and compress and change. But if we can start by getting the right reproduction, the right mapping, the right journey of midgray all the way from scene to screen, we can build everything else around that critical point of middle exposure. All right? So we've kind of teed it up already and we've started talking about it, but I want to go all the way through for a moment the scene to screen journey and what the journey of, say, this humble little pixel in the image that we have right here, what's going to happen to that patch? How is it going to go from original scene all the way out to our display? So here's what that's going to look like. I'm actually going to restore our linearized state of the image for a second here. So let's do this. This is going to look kind of silly, but bear with me. We're going to go wide gamut 4, log C4 to wide gamut 4, not L log, linear. Man, I can't believe linear was dethroned from the first L in the output gamma. I miss it. So let me label what I'm doing as we go along here. And really what I'm doing in these first two nodes is I'm modeling the stuff that is actually happening in camera as opposed to in the color corrector. So it's going to go something like this. Let's just label this. I'm going to swap these. So first thing I'll note before I even walk through what these two things do, their net is nothing. So this is just an aid for us to understand the pipeline, but we're not actually doing anything to the image yet. So what's going on here? Why did I do this? I have moved us into linear here, again, to give us that ground truth, accurate state of image as it was when it was hitting the sensor itself. This is the beginning of the journey. This is actually the state of the scene before the camera or our eyes get involved at all. Now, why does it look completely insane to our eyes if I'm saying this is the organic state of the scene? We're going to come back to that. It has to do with the other end of this pipeline, the display end of this pipeline. But for now, I just need you to take me at my word that this represents the initial starting point of our scene midgray. And we're going to be like very prejudicial in focusing just on our midgray here. So let's go ahead and go to, or actually I take that back. These pieces needed to be turned off. So this version is what represents that baseline state of our midgray. And I'm going to have this focus here set on our midgray patch that we can return to throughout our journey. So right now we're at the starting line. We've done nothing to midgray. It hasn't begun its journey. What's going to happen next? It is going to be, in most cases, let's just take a simple case. Let's say we're not shooting ARRI RAW. We're just shooting ProRes on an Alexa 35. What's going to happen in that case before that image gets encoded into a ProRes QuickTime? It is going to have a log function applied to it, right? Lots of reasons for that. It redistributes the dynamic range in a more human intuitive way. It also makes better use of the available dynamic range within the available container. So there's a number of reasons that we do this, but this is a critical part of the journey. That linear state image is going to, in many cases, be logged. Now, if we're dealing with RAW, that's a bit of a different story, but let's just focus on this particular scenario. It's going to have a log function applied. Now, if you're able to follow me up until this point, this is where, for those of you guys who already understand color management, things get a little bit simpler to understand because now we're kind of on dry land and familiar territory for color managing our image. So what's going to happen from here? Well, if you like to color manage the way that I do here on the channel, you're going to input map from your camera metric into a working space, okay? And let's look at what's going to happen to our midgray or to our image when we do this. Well, if we look at where it's resting, let's do it like this actually. I'm going to steal this window and place it here for a moment. And if we look at where this is resting, before, we're setting right around 18%, right? Once we apply our log function, we're going to be sitting right around 28%, which is where midgray of the area log C4 curve lives, right? What's going to happen now when we go into DaVinci Intermediate? It's going to move again. Now it's sitting right around 33%, which is the midgray point for DaVinci Intermediate. So this is a good feature to call out as we're going along here. Every log curve has a explicit position where it parks midgray. So in log C4, it's 28 something percent. In DaVinci Intermediate, it is 33 some odd percent. In different dome curves, it parks at different points. And we're going to return to that idea later in this conversation. So we're just following our midgray as it moves. And so far it's gone from 18 to 28 to 33. And now we're in our working space. Okay, so what's going to happen next? We're going to go in and we're going to do our grading. And for now, I'm going to completely skip over this and say no grading is going to happen whatsoever. We're just building an overall pipeline to get out to our display. We're going to now go out to our display from our working space. So we're now going from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate to our working space, okay? And now once again, for the sake of demonstration, I'm not going to target Gamma 2.2. I'm going to target linear because this is a great sort of like concept to understand for anyone who's struggling with CSTs or wants to strengthen their understanding of them. Anytime we do a CST from one log or gamma curve to another, for example, from DaVinci Intermediate to Gamma 2.2, underneath the hood, two things are happening. We are first decoding our DaVinci Intermediate log curve. We are going back to linear. Once back in linear, we are then applying our gamma function here. That's the same, works the same way here. We first are decoding our log C4 to linear, and then we are applying a linear to DaVinci Intermediate encoding. So it's always a two-step process, moving in between any two log curves or a log and a gamma curve, whatever it might be. So that's really what's happening here at the timeline level. And for the sake of our exercise, I'm actually going to make that explicit and separate in nodes. So we're going to start by just going DaVinci Wide Gamut back to, DaVinci Intermediate back to linear. Now, before I turn my highlight mode back on here, take a second to make an educated guess as to where we are going to see this gray card live on my waveform when I turn on highlight mode. Think about that for a second. Where's it going to park? Make a guess as to the number you're going to see. It's right back at 18%, right? If I set my reference level here, it's right back where it was at the beginning of the journey, all right? So this is an important concept to understand, this idea of net linear. We are actually trying for all of the twists and plot, the plot twists and turns within our imaging pipeline. What we're fundamentally trying to do with midgray is keep it in one position all the way through the pipeline and then move it out to our display. So we're going to end up undoing anything that we do and trying to keep it at the same point in order to get out to our display. But here's the fun part. I alluded a moment ago when we were first looking at this linear state image, it's like you're saying, oh, Colin, this is the normal default scene state, organic, untampered, unbothered version of the image. Well, you're saying that, but it looks completely bonkers. How could that possibly be? It looks nuts. Here's why it looks nuts. There's another aspect of the imaging pipeline that we always need to be thinking about when we're thinking about the overall journey, and that is the response of our display. So every single one of us watching this discussion right now are looking at my image on a monitor that does some sort of gamma response, okay? We might have a gamma 2.2, a gamma 2.4. In some cases, you might even be using an HDR monitor or something else with a different response. But the point is, when I send a linear image to this display, the display does not have a linear response. So I need to prepare for what the display is going to do by doing what? The opposite. I need to do the exact opposite of what the display is going to do. And here's where my friend the grayscale ramp is going to be handy. I'm going to turn this grayscale ramp DCTL on. And let's look at what happens if we even skip our luminance mapping and all of our other fancy stuff altogether, and we say all we're doing is picking up where we left off in this node. I'm going to label this one linear, okay? And then here's our ramp. So just quick recap before we take a look at this last piece. What have we done so far? We've got these two pieces, which essentially net out to no change at all. This is just returning ourselves to a linear state of image to represent the way the image was before it was encoded to a file at all. We are then applying the log function that was applied to that image before it was encoded to a file. So this is just mimicking something that happens before we ever get into Resolve. And as we've seen, the net of that is nothing. From there, we're doing a traditional color management to get from our camera metric to our working metric. We're doing no grading whatsoever at the clip level. We're going to our timeline level. We are then taking that DaVinci wide gamut intermediate working space metric that we were in and linearizing it like so. And we're now going to use this ramp to preview what happens when we take the last step, which is to apply a linear to gamma 2.2 encoding. There's what happens there. Now, as I said before, we are prejudicially focused on color, on tonality today. So this color doesn't look right because I indeed have not set this thing up properly for color. And in fact, if I wanted to do that, I could just say something like that, and that's going to be more reasonable. All right. And so now we have applied this gamma function. And the reason we've applied this gamma function, this is something I really want to emphasize, is because I'm actually going to use a little DCTL to demonstrate what I want to show you guys. This is another aha moment. By the way, gamma 2.2, gamma 2.4, those are the same thing as turning your gamma wheel. It's the same mathematical operation. I just want to look for this guy here so I can prove it to you. So check this out. What happens if I apply a gamma of 2.2 here? I get exactly what I just had a moment ago. And the reason I get that is what my display is going to do is it is going to apply a gamma of 1 over 2.2. That's the math I just did, 1 divided by 2.2. So if I do another instance of this DCTL and I set my gamma to 0.4545, what's my net going to be? My net is linear. See how that doesn't move at all? Because I went to the power of a certain number, and then I went to the power of 1 over that number, and the two cancel each other out. Now, why does this still look insane? Because I don't need to do this. This is what my display is already doing. I just wanted to give you that visual of when you properly plan for what the display is going to do, when you preempt what the display is going to do, you do an upstream inversion, essentially, you will get a net linear reproduction of the image, which is why right now at this point in the pipeline, this is the closest that we have come to the image looking correct. And if we look at where we are sitting here on our 18% gray, if we look at this value and we say, okay, that value is sitting around 45 or so, 45 out of 100. Well, we were just looking at the number 45, right? If we were to measure the light coming off of that screen, due to the fact that there is a gamma function being applied to that screen, we would get 0.45 to the power of 2.2, which would be right around 0.18. Okay, so that's the end-to-end journey. I know that it can feel kind of complex and like there's some intricacies in there, but the baseline, all that we really need to understand is as far as Midgrey is concerned, we're really starting with an arbitrarily selected reflectance level of 18%. That could be 16, it could be 14, it could be 21. We just tend to conventionally agree that it shall be 18%. And our entire imaging pipeline is really about getting to a point where by the time that light is hitting our eyes, it has a similar level to the one that it started at. Okay? That's the scene to screen journey. Let me pause there and take any questions that have come up along the way.
Okay, Tyler is asking, in a conventional workflow, verifying that the mid-gray value is at a level of 18 sets you on the correct path for accurate contrast. Is that right?
We're going to dive into that. There are multiple dimensions to think about it in that question. Fundamentally, yes. But that actually leads me to something that I wanted to emphasize to you guys here at this point. You might have noticed there's one thing missing that would make this a practical vanilla. Like if I wipe out all of the kind of like made up portions of what I just did here and I simplify this down to what I would normally have for my actual practical grading workflow, there's still one thing missing here. I want to know from you guys, what is that one thing that I am missing? I'm going to flip this correctly. What's the one thing that I didn't have a moment ago? Forward OOTF, right? If you look at this gray patch, I don't even need to measure it. You can just see that's going to move mid-gray, right? So we're going to touch more on this in a little bit, but the TLDR for right now is, unlike everywhere else in the pipeline, once you are putting mid-gray on a display, there is no single explicitly correct value for mid-gray, and it tends to be somewhere lower than 18%, just by convention. And there are a number of reasons why that tends to be the case. But by convention, actual display mid-gray is going to park lower than 18% linear, and it's going to park at a different lower value depending on how you're getting out to the display. So yes, in broadest terms, Tyler, your question is, you're absolutely right. Like we are, by tracing mid-gray and validating where it lands, we can validate that we have a sound baseline. But there is this one kind of wrinkle at the end where we can't exactly pin it down because it can move on us, and there is no explicit correct point for mid-gray to live, except to say, I will not do any OOTF or any sort of surround compensation, and I'm just going to take this as my baseline image. But the reality is there, if your eyes are like mine or most colorists I know, if you were to go in and start grading this, let me reset all this stuff. If you were to go in and start grading this image, you would just naturally gravitate toward making gray heavier than it was before. See how I just started spinning wheels and I'm just naturally making it a little bit heavier. So we'll talk more about that later. Short answer, yes. Long answer, it depends on, there are a couple of extra variables in there.
How about that mid-grade cheat sheet? Is that going to come up? We have some questions about that.
Yeah, we can talk about the mid-grade cheat sheet. You know, really what that's helpful for is like the exercise that we were doing right now and some exercises that we're going to do later for knowing where mid-gray sits within a tone curve. That's actually vital information to know, and it can really change your grading decisions, or it can change the log curve that you might select for grading is a better way to put that. So you might look at, for example, log C4 versus ACES CCT and be like, wow, one of those is like a 0.2 something. The other one is like a 0.4 something. I would rather have the middle of my image live more toward the middle of my container, more like a 0.4 than a 0.28. And for that reason, want to work in an ACES CCT tone curve instead of log C4. So that's one application, but yes, absolutely. The mid-gray cheat sheet is a great resource for just knowing explicitly where that mid-gray point in all the major log curves actually lives so that you can have that information handy and not have to commit it all to memory. That'll be linked in the description for today's video. I believe it's probably in there already, but if not, we'll make sure it's there right after we wrap our session.
Well, I think we're good for now.
Okay, rock and roll. All right, great questions, guys. Yeah, so let's keep tracking here. So we now understand the scene to screen journey. We understand this concept of net linear. We understand that there is no fixed value for mid-gray once our image hits the display. And let's actually like just kind of get a better lens on that for just a second. So let's wipe out everything that we just did. We're just going to go clean slate here for a minute. I'm going to turn off everything at every point in my timeline. So I'm just looking at original camera state image here. And we're going to do a quick comparison. Number one, we're going to do an ACES transform from log C4 to Rec 709. And let's grab a still of that. And now we're going to do a CST. I'm just going to modify something for my power grades here by saying, instead of DaVinci wide gamut, let's do wide gamut for log C4. So both of these are a log C4 to Rec 709 transform that I'm imparting, right? But check it out. Midgrey is not living at the exact same point. It's a little bit lower here in ACES than it is in Resolve Color Management. Or another one that we could look at would be Aries Reveal. This is Aries' recommended path for getting out to display from a log C4 camera. Like so. You can see it's close, but it's definitely higher here than it was in ACES. Let me zoom you in. See that? ACES, it's lower than log C4. Even though they both represent a sound journey and they both are managing middle gray consciously and intelligently, they're mapping mid-gray on the display side to slightly different points. Okay, where do we want to go from here? So let's get practical now. Now that we understand these things, let's talk about how we can use mid-gray. Like, what is it actually practically applicable for? I want to show you a couple different ways that you can use it. One of them, biggest one maybe for me, is to evaluate or to build a look. So let's take a look at, I'm going to kind of go back a few steps here and get my contour look back in place here. We'll go back to our CST that we had here. We'll go back here and turn our input transform back on. So we've got our full color management pipeline built back out now. And what I want to look at now is what happens to mid-gray when I just look at it through my look? Because in look design, as you guys have, many of y'all have heard me talk about before, in look design, we generally don't want to move middle gray. Why not? What's the problem with moving middle gray? Well, because at that point in the process, it is unlikely that a macro level transform that moves exposure is on average going to improve your exposures. Unless all of your exposures are off by the same amount in the same direction, what you're going to do is make some things better, possibly, and make many things worse. Because if there's some that are under, there's also going to be some that are over, and the ones that are over, if you're moving things further up, for example, you're actually going to be making the exposure worse and creating more work for yourself on the grading side. So we want to feel like we are preserving mid-gray in the creation of our look prior to doing our actual grading. So if we just take a look at, again, we're going to go to my exposure chart, which I've got set to a single patch of DaVinci wide gamut gray, and I can see when I'm going to go ahead and turn off my output transform just to make this really easy. Again, well, actually, never mind what I was about to say. Just let's look at our mid-gray point here. It's sitting right where it should, around 33, right? But what I want to know is, hey, in this look that I built with contour in this case, is my mid-gray moving? In this case, no, because contour is designed to always preserve middle gray. But you could also look at a lot like, let's look at my 2383 for a second. Also free download if you guys don't already have this LUT. This is built to work in a color managed pipeline like the one that I'm using here. And let's look at this one when I turn it on my image. So this one is actually going to slightly move mid-gray, less in terms of level and more in terms of balance. Okay, so typically with a look, we don't want to move mid-gray in terms of its level or in terms of its amounts of red, green, and blue. Like it should be R equals G equals B. And we don't want to change that typically in our look. And yet that's happening here. Why is that happening? And you can even see it here in the histogram. Those levels are no longer perfectly aligned between red, green, and blue. Well, the reason that's happening is because this was built to mimic a print film emulation that this LUT was built upon, which actually does this to values that are at this point. So in this case, this is not a stock that I designed. This is a stock that I'm emulating or mimicking, and it has this behavior at this point. So there's exceptions to every rule. And this is one where, hey, to capture the behavior of this particular set of film data, I actually need color bias right here. And so for that reason, I am going to move the image. But in most cases, the more common way we would use middle gray is to evaluate what our look is doing to middle gray. And if we see that something has moved, for example, we might draw a contrast curve that we think looks nice as part of our look dev process. And we might then go and turn on our DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray patch and audition what's happening and see, oh, I'm actually moving mid-gray up a skosh with this curve. So I should really find a way to lock it. And we can do that by holding down Option. And let's make sure this histogram is set to input. So I'm looking at the input state of the image, not the state of the image after I've adjusted it with my curves. Once that's set like so, I'm holding down Option and I'm setting this control point right here. That didn't seem to take. No, really resolve. Make it input. There we go. And now you can see just by dropping that control point, if I flip things off and on now I'm preserving middle gray because I'm aware of middle gray. I'm aware conceptually that at this point in my process, at the look dev stage of my process, I typically want to see no movement in exposure or in color balance. And you could do the same thing, by the way, if you were doing like whatever, like a split tone scheme and you're like, oh, I want to cool off my shadows. I want to pull some red out of my low end. Well, before I had this control point, I might have done something like this and it might have looked good on my image itself, maybe a little extreme, but let's just kind of feather that back a little bit. Like that might look good on the image itself, but when I actually evaluate it through a patch of mid-gray, I can see that I am biasing mid-gray. Now, why should I care about that? What's the big deal about that? Well, as we just saw with my 2383, there's no rule that says you can't do it. Color grading police aren't going to come and arrest you. It doesn't have to be a problem. However, if we just deviate for a second into the concerns of look development, the idea here is that you want to have some portion of your image that is allowed to pass through untouched, untampered, unadjusted by the look. Generally, that's going to be your middle exposures. So you want those not to be moved up or down and not to be cooled off or turned green or turned pink. You want those to pass through, and then you're going to build everything up around that more neutral kind of center point that everything's passing through. So that's one way, one great way that you can use mid-gray. That's the way that I use it all the time, just as a confidence check, a reality check when I'm building a look or when I'm evaluating a look that someone else is furnishing for me. Does it move mid-gray in terms of balance or exposure? If so, then I can work to adjust that. If not, then I know that my look is doing exactly what it should and nothing that it shouldn't be doing, right? Here's another one. The question came up about the mid-gray cheat sheet a moment ago. We can use mid-gray to evaluate the suitability of a tone curve for grading. So this is a really easy one. If I want to grade in, for example, let's say I want to grade in log C4, or I want to know what that feels like instead of DaVinci Intermediate. By the way, you guys might like this. There's no rule that says you can't do what I'm about to do here. If you're like, oh, I like DaVinci Wide Gamut as my color space and I like log C4 as my gamma, you could totally do that. Map into log C4 here and then simply output from log C4 here. The base image that you start with is actually going to be the same. The only reason it's looking a little bit different right now is because of this look that was designed for DaVinci Intermediate. But this base image compared to saying DaVinci Intermediate here and here, this base image is going to be the same in both cases. No change, right? All that matters, the big thing that's going to change here is you will be grading in a different tone curve with a different mid-gray point. If you look on your mid-gray cheat sheet, you'll see that the mid-gray point for log C4 is significantly lower than the mid-gray point for DaVinci Intermediate. And as a result, everything that you do is going to have a bit of a different feel to it. So like here at the clip level, definitely your primaries, those are going to respond different. They're going to feel different. Your custom curves, your mid-gray point is going to be much lower when you're grading in log C4 than it will be when you're grading in DaVinci Intermediate. Like just to sort of eyeball it, here is where if I drop this DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray patch, do a new serial node and eyedropper, there's my control point for DaVinci Intermediate, right? What happens if I'm in log C4? It's lower, right? Now if I eyedropper, it's going to be there. So my pivot point between log C4 and DaVinci Intermediate is this versus that. So that's another thing you can use Midgrey for, is to audition or evaluate a tone curve and its feeling. Because remember, unless we are using color managed or color space aware tools, which is not many tools in Resolve, we're just going to get different feel, different behavior, especially in our primaries, depending on the tone curve that we choose and depending on where it plots middle gray. So that's another great thing you can use Midgrey for. Here's another one. We already touched on this for a second. You can use middle gray to evaluate the suitability of a DRT for your creative intent. Now, I will say this. DRT, that would just be an output transform or a CST, whatever you want to call it. We looked at ACES versus Resolve Color Management versus Aries Reveal a moment ago. We already saw, like, those are generally all going to park middle gray, I would say somewhere in between, like gamma terms, somewhere between a 0.35 and a 0.4. Like, it's not going to be a huge variance because there's sort of an accepted level of like what makes for a balanced, like reasonable exposure of middle exposure being fed in, but it still makes a difference. And it's something that you can absolutely use as part of your criteria for deciding, hey, do I want to use Aries Reveal to grade this? Do I want to use ACES? Do I want to use ACES 2.0? Do I want to use Resolve Color Management? Do I want to use Red's output transforms? Like, there are so many different paths that you can use to get out that last mile to your display. And each of them is going to have its own point that it parks middle gray at. And so it's absolutely a sensible evaluation criterion to look at, well, where does this one park middle gray? And does it feel too heavy or too airy to me? And in some cases, like in the case of Resolve Color Management, for example, you actually have the opportunity to move that point. That's what this adaptation slider is about. Check this out. If I do DaVinci Wide Gamut Gray once again, and I adjust my adaptation, you can actually see I've got pretty significant control over where mid-gray is being plotted on the display end of things. And there are other DRTs that have similar features to this and others that don't, such as ACES. But that would be another thing that you can absolutely use your knowledge of middle gray for, is to evaluate a DRT. Okay, one more thing I wanted to talk about here. Oh yeah, so we'll take another pause in a second and answer some questions, but I just want to complete the thought of like, when should and shouldn't I move middle gray? I feel like that was a big thing for me when I first started learning all this stuff, is I felt a little handcuffed. So I'm like, oh, now I feel like I'm sort of like shackled by this commandment that thou shalt not move middle gray. But here's the thing, that's not actually true. We want to feel free to move middle gray because middle gray really just represents exposure and middle exposure. We want to feel very free to move it intuitively and non-quantitatively in our color grading process. And one of the things that allows us to do that efficiently without wasted time and energy and effort is to have a balanced system. So it is at the system level that we want to quantify and validate where mid-gray is parked all the way through the pipeline. And it is at the grading level where we want to say, I don't care what the numbers say. I'm looking at the image and I'm parking middle exposure where I wish to see it land visually, and I'm relying on my monitor to make that assessment. Does that make sense? So you really do have to apply kind of a dichotomy, like mid-gray is for validating your systems, and it is not for shackling your creative decisions. Once it comes time to grade, open it up, shut it down, put it wherever looks good. Don't even measure it. It doesn't matter. But if you are wanting to calibrate your system and give yourself the most breezy experience of intuitively grading your image without measurement along the way, that's where you want to have a level system established and have a validated system established as well. Okay, questions on any of that, on ways that we can use middle gray?
Okay, related to what you were just saying, Tim is asking, is it common that a DP would want to have a specific part of the scene be where middle gray should land? And if so, what are optimal ways to hit it while keeping balanced contrast?
That they would want to have a part of the scene be where middle gray should land. I mean, I would say it's certainly common for a production team to feel like, oh, we want to move the exposure of this image up or down. But no, I can't say I've explicitly run into a lot of situations where a DP is like, oh, I want to dig this way out of the shadows and promote it to the same level as the things I middle exposed. I think most cinematographers understand that that's going to be a difficult thing to sell visually, because whatever you're using, whether it's a power window or a qualifier or something else, you're making such an aggressive move and you're moving two things quite close together that we're very far apart. So I would say typically no in like the extreme form of that concept, but it definitely happens all the time. And it's like, yeah, I want to promote that up. And the way you could do it, I put it this way, like at that point in the process, when I'm working with a creative collaborator, I'm more inclined than saying, oh, you were measuring at whatever, like a 0.18 or a 0.2, and you're now measuring at a 0.25. I'm less inclined to do that and more inclined to do something like this, where like, let's say I don't know, we want to dig out some little detail like down like around mom's jeans here. I would be more inclined to window that area if that's a sensible way of isolating what I want to bring up, and then just like HDR globaling it and saying, okay, cool, I'm going to give you a half a stop. So I'm just giving a relative measurement and saying that is about a half a stop promotion of that area from where it started, as opposed to giving a numerical quantification of where it started and where it has landed, and the relationship of those numbers to the mid-grade of the system. That's pretty geeky stuff. I feel like not only for our client and for whomever we're working with, but for us to be thinking about them real time as well. Like by the time I'm grading, I don't want to be thinking about numbers or thinking about them at least as little as possible.
Okay, what is the difference between normalized and 10-bit code value of your mid-grade cheat sheet? And what value should we use for look dev process?
Oh, great question. So the difference between those, it's really just the relative scale. So it's centimeters versus inches. So normalized versus 10-bit, you can see those reflected here in the controls for our scopes. So if we look at waveform scale style, I'm looking at percentage right now. Percentage equals normalized. Normalized just means normal to fall within 0 to 1. 10-bit means a range of 0 to 1023. 12-bit means a range of 0 to 4096, because that is the number of explicit, like discrete bits available to us within those systems. So, and 8-bit would be 255, for example. So I give them in both metrics because different people like to use their scopes in different ways. I tend to think about things in percentage because I find percentage to be a pretty intuitive metric, but you can use either as long as you are matching your waveform scale style to have the same unit of measurement, if that makes sense. So make sure you're measuring and evaluating things in inches or centimeters, whichever makes more sense for you.
Diego asked, do you have to set the timeline color space in the settings if you want the tools to behave differently? In this case, isn't the timeline color space set to DWG at a project setting level?
That is correct. So if I were, because right now I'm working, am I still in? No, I'm back in DaVinci Intermediate right now. But for example, when I had just flipped into log C4, like so, absolutely correct. I would want to not only set these things in that way, I would want to tell Resolve, hey, I'm working in my own funky timeline color space of DaVinci wide gamut, area log C4. So yes, if you want to get specifically the HDR palette to behave properly, you would need to do this as well as those first two parts of changing your input and your output transform. Okay, guys, let me show you a couple more things and then we'll have time for a few more questions before we wrap. So I want to show you guys a couple of ways that I use Midgrey that are related to things that we looked at, but also kind of distinct. So here's one really fun one. This is a tool that I developed for cinematographers that we just released here recently. It's a tool called Sweet Spot that is designed as an intuitive and a more accurate, more intuitive alternative to all the false color systems that we see out there. It's called Sweet Spot, and it reflects my love of Midgrey because it is essentially, you could think of it as a one zone false color system. All it shows you is what is hitting the sweet spot of your camera sensor, which we designate for a default as 1/2 stop below to 1/2 or to 1 stop over middle gray of whatever your camera metric is. So let's look at sweet spot on like a log C4 image here. So just recapping, I'm not doing anything here now to the image. And I'm just going to go to these examples here and let's look at sweet spot. So this is everything in the image which falls from between 1/2 stop under middle gray and 1 stop over middle gray. So this is something that I designed that was really just inspired by my love of mid-gray and by the simplicity that I feel like it has brought to my systems and my ability to evaluate my systems and their functionality. Same thing can be done on set. I'm like, hey, don't worry about the 8 gazillion zones. And instead, here is middle exposure. Here's what's hitting the sweet spot of your sensor. If it is important to you, you should see it here. If it is less important to you, you might want to be equally concerned that you are not seeing it. So for example, if I use my HDR palette let's take the advice that we just gave and say that we want to set our color space to wide gamut 4 and our gamma to log C4, since that's currently what I'm in, and I want to spin my HDR, you can actually see if I'm mimicking dropping the exposure in camera, well, I'm too far under now because there's not enough hitting the sweet spot. And as I start to spin to the right, same thing will happen as I punch through the other side. Now I'm not getting enough image in the sweet spot because it's too hot. It's going too far over, right? So this is one way that I use mid-gray is to, like provide a tool and a means of evaluating sound exposure in a simple, intuitive, accurate, real-time way for cinematographers. And funny enough, some members of my Discord community have actually ended up using this in an application that I didn't originally envision, which is just to visually identify exposure in the color grading in the post-production process. So you could actually use it in that way as well. It's designed as a production tool, and like I said, it's one of the more fun applications of mid-gray that I've had in the last couple of years here. Here's another one, a really fun one that I want to show you guys that I just think is a good example of the fun ideas and concepts that can come to mind when you start thinking about middle gray and its role. So remember we talked a minute ago about like using mid-gray to evaluate a tone curve, right? So we've got like log C4 versus ACES CCT, for example, or versus DaVinci Intermediate, and thinking about those as like, oh, well, where is their native mid-gray point, and does that feel good in my hands, and does it interact with my color grading tools in an intuitive way for me? I came up with this little tool that I've been playing around with that I'm just calling mid-gray map, that within whatever curve you are operating in, it is going to promote your mid-gray value to whatever you say. So let's say we want to have gray living at 0.6. I'm going to turn this side off for a second and then I'll explain what that one's doing. So let's once again use my DaVinci wide gamut gray. And all that I'm doing here is let's turn off my output transform as well. And all I'm doing is taking what starts as 0.336, which is the native mid-gray of DaVinci Intermediate, and I'm promoting it all the way up to a 0.6, 60%, right? Then all I'm doing on the other side is undoing that process, like so. So if I turn these both off and on, mid-gray is not moving at all, right? And if I delete this and we flip this off and on, nothing's happening at all. Well, that's great, but what's the fun of that? Well, right here, I have a mid-gray point of 0.6, and that's going to do two main things for me. The first thing is it's going to make my primaries feel very different. Wow, that alarmed me. I'm getting amber alerted here. That was really loud. Okay, where was I? So this is going to it's going to alter the behavior of my primaries. So check this out. If I turn my whole stack back on and I start doing some grading here, and I'm just going to go like lift up, gamma down, for example. Let me just double check my pipeline here is back in the right position. Yeah, okay, cool. So I'm going to do that grading adjustment here. Now, let's check out, this is the same adjustment, lift up, gamma down. But if I turn off these two things at a moment ago, when I turned these both off simultaneously, what was happening? Nothing was changing, right? But now, depending on whether I have sandwiched this operation in these adjustments or not, I'm getting different behavior, right? I'm getting different feel in real time from my primaries because of where middle gray rests within my tone curve inside of this sandwich. Okay. So this is just something that I started kicking around and playing with that I'm not going to release immediately. But I do want to show you guys one more thing here. I'm going to show you a simple alternative that you can do right within Resolve. So here's just a native mapping. All I'm doing is using the native gamma to move mid-gray up to approximately where I want to see it. So let's say I wanted to move it to around a 0.5. So I'm just eyeballing my level on my waveform and saying, hey, let's promote that up. I guess I'm actually moving it to a 40%, 0.4. Okay. So I'm promoting it up to a 0.4. I keyed these values in. I typed in 0.05, 0.05, 0.05, so I know it's right on the number. Then I can do my same thing here. And then I'm going to go back down by going negative 0.05, negative 0.05, etc. I also keyed these in so that I'm precisely applying the exact same gamma forward and backwards. And now I've got a similar setup just here natively within Resolve that allows me to get different feel in my primaries. And here's the other thing that I didn't show a minute ago that I wanted to highlight. If you guys have ever felt like in your custom curves, you need more room to shape your shadows than you get from log C forward be an extreme example, but a lot of tone curves that have like lower mid-gray points like red log 3G10 or even DaVinci Intermediate is kind of on the low end of things. You've now got more room to work because mid-gray is like here as opposed to being like around there before. So now you just have more real estate to intuitively work the low end of your image, which can be kind of fun as well. So those are the two like obvious applications that I kind of had in mind when I was first building that mid-gray mapper, but there's probably more still that you can think of. And all that is really just blooming from the fact that I'm always thinking about mid-gray and its application and the way that it interacts with what we do when we're grading. So just a quick recap, if you guys want to build this for yourself, all you need to do is take my exposure chart with the settings that we've been using throughout this discussion. Total step of 1, turn show ramp off. Take your exposure chart and use your gamma keyed in numerically so that you're getting the exact number to drive things up to whatever mid-gray point you're looking for. Make sure when you're doing this, you have your timeline or your output transform and your look turned off completely. Okay. So let's say we wanted to make this a 60. I would look at this and then I could even just go in and manually type these so that I know I'm right on the number, like so. And then I would do a blank node in between, and I would do a second node where I do negative 0.28, negative 0.28, negative 0.28, negative 0.28. So I've got a do nothing operation, but in between I can grade, and I've got, in that case, like in my custom curves, here's my mid-gray point, and I've got all this room to shape the low end of the image. And same thing, like my primaries are now going to feel way different than they felt before I made that promotion of mid-gray, because so much more of my overall signal is taking place below that mid-gray point. So again, there would be like lift down, gamma up with that sandwich versus without. Very different feel, very different response in the controls. So if you want to try that for yourself, that's hopefully a nice, clear recipe for how you can do that. Yeah, and I'll shut up. We can take a couple more questions before we wrap for the day.
Okay, why does the CKC exposure tool not show a linear graph if I turn off ODT when I check show ramp option?
Bonus. So glad this came up. I actually been meaning to make a dedicated video about this, which we might still do, but let's chop that one up for a second. So the question is, if I'm in my exposure chart here and I turn everything else off and I'm on my grayscale ramp. That's not what I want. I want this guy. And I show my ramp and I set my tone curve to linear. Why am I not seeing, let's turn this ramp off here and set our total steps to something large. I'm not seeing anything anywhere close to a linear ramp like I might expect to see if I were to drop this on here. It doesn't conform to that whatsoever, right? Well, what's the deal? Isn't this a linear ramp, and shouldn't I expect to see this thing hug those contours? Well, This tone curve is linear exposures, and the increment for this chart, whether we're in linear or anything else, is stops, specifically whatever increment we select here. So I've selected an increment of stops. Stops don't move in a straight line. Stops move exponentially. How do we get added stops or remove stops from a position? We multiply by 2 to the power of the number of stops we want to apply. So 2 to the power of, that is an exponential operation. That's why we get this distribution that we see right here, where like, man, in linear, it takes off really fast and I can't even see, even if I'm doing like 16 stops, I hit the ceiling like here. And even though these are separate, discrete patches, we have to just assume that's the case because we can't see it. And same thing here in the low end. It is a exponential distribution of the tones. So it is not saying I will give you a linear ramp in terms of even distribution. It is saying I will give you linear steps of exposure, which are exponential in nature. So that's what's going on there.
Okay, can you please explain, does mid-gray stay in log C 3 or 4, 29 to 39 IRE, if I map to 709 2.4? Does the image stretch from 18% like a contrast pivoted to 18%?
Does the image stretch from 18%? No. What's happening there? I mean, this is where we can use this grayscale ramp. You can actually see, like if I look at, let's just use Aries stock transform to go from here to display. We can use the old school log C 3 version here, except that's like an inverse or something. There we go. So that's what's happening. It's not a straight up contrast pivot. It's close-ish if you have use S-curve turned on, but it's, I think like the more detailed way to think about it is that we are doing some linear contrast in the middle here, but then we have controlled compression at the top and bottom in the way that we typically don't have. We don't have it's the same rough idea with contrast pivot, but contrast pivot is a much cruder, coarser instrument than the amount of control that we have with our what we call scene linear to display linear, like tone mapping operation. So broadest strokes, simplest answer, yes, but the reality is not really. Like you would not be able to produce a very good tone map just from contrast pivot inside of your primaries. Okay, we got time for one more.
Okay, Leon asks a bit of a personal question, but what's your opinion on looks that operate very close to middle gray and, for example, tint the fill side of a face?
Oh, looks that operate very close to middle gray and tint the fill side of the face. From a philosophical point of view, I'll put it to you this way. Unless there's a specific reason, I just feel like any image, unless an image is just going to have like a big wash to it, like, I don't know, that frame that everyone goes nuts over from Blade Runner 2049 where Gosling is like walking into like the abandoned Vegas, like that big establishing shot, some big crazy wash where like there's nothing neutral in there, there's not supposed to be anything neutral in there. Unless you are going for an explicitly for a look like that, I feel like one of the biggest tools we have in our arsenal as colorists is the ability to sort of hang things around neutrals. So if we have a tone curve, or rather if we have a look that biases things, middle gray, from that center, that diminishes my ability to get a neutral. Like maybe there's a neutral elsewhere, maybe there's no neutral at all. But in either case, if I don't have a neutral and I have it at a known sensible position in my tone scale, I feel like for me as a colorist, in the majority of cases, that's actually removing a really powerful tool from my arsenal, which is to build color contrast around a neutral. If I don't have that, then it's one fewer tool than I'm used to operating with. Can you grade through that? Can you still get great images? Absolutely. Is that something that I think is best practice in most cases, or that I would want as the colorist to have taken off of my plate? Probably not. So I think right below the fill side, like we can round this out with looking at contour here. And if we look at like the split curve that I have within contour right now, it peels off pretty fast, you know. And if we look at the net curve, even more so if we turn this off and we just graph everything like so, like that crossover is not particularly large. It's pretty small. And like you can see, especially if I'm flirting with kind of moodier exposure, like in my HDR, I can pretty quickly get fill side being tinted. So it's not that I'm opposed to the fill side of a face being tinted or to fill side of any middle exposed object being tinted, but I want to make sure that there is a spot in this curve that I know of and that is in a sensible position where I have true neutral exposure and true neutral color balance. Okay, guys, what did you think of this one? Was this fun? Did you enjoy it? I feel like we got through a lot in this time and you guys had some great questions. Love to hear your thoughts on how this went, whether you're watching this live in the recording or you're checking it out after the fact. We're still playing with this format and would love to hear everyone likes it and whether you enjoy it, find it valuable. I had a blast, as you guys heard me say at the beginning of the session. I love middle gray. It's like one of my absolute favorite topics in motion imaging. So glad we got to chop it up today. And I hope I helped fill in some important blanks for you in terms of how middle gray works, what middle gray is, and the ways that we can practically apply it and leverage our knowledge of it to do better color grading work. So thanks a bunch for joining. Thanks to Annie for co-hosting with me, and we'll see you guys here on the channel super soon. Enjoy your Monday.